Good evening. Welcome back to another episode of History to Fall Asleep To in our book, The Last Crusade, by Warren Carroll. We have approached Part 4. Part 3 ended with the communist takeover of the Spanish government and the introduction of Francisco Franco, who was soon to be the nationalists' leader and savior. We resume Part 4. In presenting Franco, we must first divest ourselves of myth. He was not a tyrant or an oppressor, and certainly no totalitarian. He may have been too severe towards his enemies, but he never enslaved his own people. He was not eager for power, though he came to believe God had chosen him to save Spain from destruction and persecution of his fellow Catholics. He did not allow elections to choose a government or a completely free press, because to him that meant a return to the revolutionary anarchy of the Second Spanish Republic. But during all his years of rule after the Civil War, the Spanish people could say what they liked in the cafes and plazas, and regularly did so. He opposed Hitler, frustrating him and his plans by sheer stubbornness in the 1940s, and in 1940 especially, the year of Hitler's greatest power. He accepted arms from Germany and Italy during the Spanish Civil War because no one else would give him any or sell him any, and the Soviet Union was supplying Largo Caballero's government with large quantities of some of the best modern weapons. In the spring of 1936, in the Canary Islands, Franco walked in the Valley of the Shadow. He and his adored wife and daughter were under 24-hour guard against assassination. Always a strong Catholic, his faith became far more profound under these conditions. In the words of Stanley Payne, a noted historian of Spain, his thoughts turned more to religion than at any previous time in his life. Franco's practice of almost daily devotions dated from these months. This intensified religious life, in turn, contributed to what eventually became a sense of mission. Of Francisco Franco, Paul Johnson has well said, "The Nationalists won the Spanish Civil War primarily because of the capacity and judgment of Franco. Though Franco was an unlovable man and is unlikely ever to win the esteem of historians, he must be accounted one of the most successful public men of the century. His cold heart went with a cool head, great intelligence, and formidable reserves of courage and will. The soldier-statesman he most resembled was Wellington, a figure much admired in Spain. Franco thought war a hateful business, from which gross cruelty was inseparable. It might sometimes be, though, a necessary way to advance civilization. He was in the tradition of the Romans, the Crusaders, the Conquistadors, and the Tercios of Parma. Franco was never a fascist or had the smallest belief in any kind of utopia or system. Franco was short and pudgy, and looked insignificant, except for his large and commanding dark brown eyes. But he had a lion's heart and a steel-hard backbone. But more than any other man, he saved Spain from the worst fate that could befall any nation in the 20th century, conquest by communism, giving his people instead a generation and a half of peace, security, prosperity, and personal, if not political, freedom in which the Catholic faith was restored and flourished throughout the country. The Valley of the Fallen will stand against the sky as his just monument when all his venomous critics are dust." During the spring of 1936, many Catholic schools throughout Spain were closed, and some physically destroyed. On June 3rd, Cita Cortes deputy Pabon said that in central Castile alone, from April 20th to May 15th, 79 schools with over 5,000 pupils had been burned down or closed. On June 4th, Gil Robles, with most of the Cita deputies, walked out of the Cortes because of what was being done to the Catholic schools. But the government was obdurate. Socialist deputies stressed what the Constitution required in the closing of Catholic schools and should now be rigorously enforced on this point. Education Minister Barnes declared on June 4th that the Catholics must lose their schools because they had not done enough to develop the secular state education when they controlled the government. God was to be excluded from all Spanish education, come what might. On June 4th, General Mola had his first meeting with the major Carlist leader, José Oriol, Carlist chief in Álava province. Oriol offered Mola full support in his planned rising, and put him in touch for the first time with Fal Conde. On June 9th, Mola met with the Count of Rodezno, a Navarrese who had been the Secretary-General of the Traditionalist Communion for all Spain before Fal Conde. He promised Rodezno that the old red and gold flag of Spain, which the Republic had abolished, would be flown by the armies of the Uprising. Meanwhile, on June 5th, Mola circulated a secret memorandum on how Spain would be governed after the military coup. The existing constitution would be suspended, and the Cortes dismissed, and a directory of officers consisting of a president and 4 others would act as a provisional government, ruling by a decree until a new constituent assembly met. However, the republic would be maintained rather than the monarchy restored, and church and state would continue to be separated. This was contrary to Carlist goals, so on June 11th, Fal Conde sent José Zamanillo to Mola with a set of firm Carlist conditions for supporting the military rising Mola was planning. 1. It was to be conducted under the red and gold flag of the monarchy. 2. The Republican Constitution was to be scrapped. 3. The state was to be a Catholic rather than secular. 4. Political parties were to be abolished and a corporate state established, in which different social elements were represented rather than the whole population of legislative districts voting for representatives in the Cortes. 5. The provisional government must have a Carlist Minister of Education, Propaganda, and Church Relations, while the Minister for Local Government and Corporations was to be either a Carlist or someone fully acceptable to them. Mola replied to Zamanillo 2 days later that these terms were inadmissible and would commit the new state to sectional interests. On June 16th, Fal Conde came to Pamplona to meet Mola. They conferred all day at the Iraq monastery near Estella, which had been the Carlist capital during the Third Carlist War of 1870 to 1876. Mola, unyielding, gave Fal Conde his memorandum of June 5th, stating his intention to maintain the Republic and the separation of church and state. Fal Conde reiterated the demands he had sent Zamanillo to make on June 11th. The two stubborn men did not like each other and clashed repeatedly. No progress was made. On that same day in Madrid, Gil Robles presented the latest statistics on revolutionary destruction since the February elections. 160 churches totally destroyed, 269 mainly political murders, and 1,287 assaults in the same category. A country can live under a monarchy or a republic with a parliamentary or a presidential system, under communism or fascism, but it cannot live in anarchy, Gil Robles cried. Now, alas, Spain is in anarchy. During the next few days, Miguel Maura, the Second Republic's first Minister of the Interior, spoke out after a long silence. Spain, he said, confronted nearly 3 million revolutionaries in the Anarchist Union CNT and Largo Caballeros Militant Socialist Union UGT, about 1.5 million in each. The Republic, which he had helped to create, had been transformed into a tool of the revolutionaries. Miguel Maura, a Republican who was to support the government during the Civil War, spoke the simple, hard truth, which quotations already represented in this book have amply proved, but which many historians of the Spanish Civil War and its causes still refuse to face. Quote, "Today, the Republic is no more, though I would like to believe unconsciously, than the tool of the violent revolutionary sector of the working classes, which, shielded by the liberal democratic system and the blindness of certain leaders of the Republican parties, is preparing in minute detail an assault on the government and the extermination of capitalist and middle-class society. They tell us this themselves in their newspapers and public meetings. If the Republic is to be this, it is inexorably condemned to swift extinction at the hands of those who claim to be its defenders, or, which is more probable, at the hands of a reaction from the opposite direction." End quote. On June 23rd, Franco made a last appeal to the government by writing to Prime Minister Césares Quiroga, warning him that the recent events were imperiling the discipline of the army, a rather transparent reference to the prospect of a military coup. Césares Quiroga did not reply. The next day, Mola signed his approval of the planned rising of the regular army in Morocco under Colonel Yag, to be signaled by a coded telegram which Mola would send at the appropriate moment. All his arrangements with the generals were made, but he held up the signal while he continued his negotiations with the Carlists. Though Mola did not like the Carlist political program, he had come to realize that without active Carlist support, at least in Navarra, there would be no rising there. The Asturian troops stationed there under his direct command were unreliable, since their province, which had revolted against the governments of Larue and Gil Robles in 1934, had been deeply penetrated by the left. Mola probably knew that the Carlists were also sufficiently well organized and prepared in many other parts of Spain to make their support exceedingly valuable. Indeed, only they could give the rising a genuinely popular character, make it more than strictly military coup. On June 30th, he met with three principal Navarrese Carlist leaders, the Count of Rodezno, Joaquin Balastena, and José Martínez Barrasan. They seemed more flexible to him than Falconde, more eager to join the rising regardless of the nature of the new government it would install. But the Carlists were highly organized throughout Spain and had a strong military force in being, the Raquette, ready to put into the field. Mola needed the support of the whole communion, and only Falconde could give it to him. The stakes were very high. Military coups have been frequent in the history of Hispanic countries, and sometimes their governments last for many years, but none endure for very long, historically speaking. Military men can rescue a country and rule it throughout a time of crisis. A particularly gifted general like Franco may rule for a lifetime, but in the end the soldiers will return to their barracks, and civilians must be found to govern. Without clear new principles to guide it, civilian government would reflect, at best, merely the personal interests of its leaders, at worst, a renewal of revolution. The new Catholic Spain, which the Carlists sought, could not be built by generals alone. The Carlists must have a major part in creating it, because in the end only they fully understood and could preserve it. Mola would not give them that role. Franco, wholly non-ideological as he was, never really understood the Carlists nor gave them power. But General Sanjurjo, son of a Raquette father slain in the Third Carlist War, might have done so. He was their hope, and to him they now turned. After another meeting of Falconde and Mola, July 7th, produced no results whatsoever, Falconde sent Antonio Lizarza to Portugal to urge Sanjurjo to persuade Mola to make substantial concessions to the Carlists. The critical negotiations of the next week have been much reviewed and discussed by historians, who have tended to dwell on the great difficulty Falconde and Prince Javier could have had in holding the Raquette back if the rising occurred without them, and therefore to state or imply that Mola could have simply assumed their support and did not really need to make any concessions to them. Also for this reason, the concessions which the Carlists did eventually obtain from Sanjurjo are dismissed as illusory or unimportant. Though there is some force in these arguments, they have been greatly overstated, for Mola could not afford to assume anything. His very life was at stake. If the rising failed and he was captured, he would be shot. He said later that he would have killed himself if the Carlists had not joined him. He very much wanted a free hand after the rising began, and was prepared to go a long way to get it, but not all the way. Not a total rejection of all the Carlists sought. They did have some bargaining leverage with him, as Falconde the lawyer knew well. Carlism was an old cause which had been thought dead. It had been revived by an extraordinary combination of historical convergences and coincidences. The Carlists would almost certainly never have such an opportunity again. They must make the most of it. Their future depended on gaining strong influence in the new government of Spain that would be established by a successful rising. They must come into the rising as full partners, with a pledge from the military leadership to grant at least a substantial part of what meant most to them. For this they looked now to Sanjurjo. On July 9th, Sanjurjo wrote a letter for Lizarza to take back to Falconde and Mola, saying that the Carlists should be allowed to fly the red and gold flag of the monarchy from the beginning, while the regular army at the outset of the rising should fly no flag at all, that the provisional government after the rising should be apolitical, including civilian as well as military members, and should dismantle the republic, rectify its religious and social legislation, abolish political parties, and establish a genuinely new state, without the liberal parliamentary system. He made no mention of the Ministry of Education, Propaganda, and Church Relations, or of the Ministry of Local Government. Even so, the concessions were large, much of what Falconde had demanded. Lizarza was overjoyed, firmly believing that Sanjurjo had given his backing to the Carlists. When Lizarza presented Sanjurjo's letter to Mola July 12th, Mola questioned its authenticity. Later it was reported that it lacked a secret countermark, which Sanjurjo placed on his genuine letters, and that Sanjurjo sent a separate emissary to Mola, unknown to Lizarza, to explain that he had only signed the letter to keep the Carlists in the movement. He was not restricting Mola's freedom of action. This report, contained in the Spanish government's official history of the Spanish Civil War, but not attested elsewhere, is open to grave doubt, for it was very much in the interest of the Franco government after the Civil War to deny that any commitment had ever been made to the Carlists, who had no significant role in that government, especially since Sanjurjo and Mola, who might have set the record straight, were by then both dead. On the face of it, the letter is genuine, and Lizarza, who received it personally from Sanjurjo, always insisted that it was. On that same day, apparently, without yet knowing the contents of Sanjurjo's letter, Balasteña, Beresain, and two other Navarrese Carlist leaders went to Saint-Jean-de-Luz to confer with Javier, telling him that Mola had agreed to allow the Requete to use the red and gold flag, and the Carlists to administer Navarra after the rising. Javier said this was not good enough, and he would have to contact Alfonso Carlos in Vienna before accepting these minor concessions as sufficient to justify full Carlist support of the rising. But when pressed, Javier agreed that if the rising occurred before Alfonso Carlos' reply arrived, he would commit the Requete to it. The next day, Monday, July 13th, Mola received the news of the murder of rightist leader Calvo Sotelo the preceding night, and he set the hour of the rising in Morocco at dawn, 5 a.m. Saturday, July 18th, with the risings in Spain to come on the following day. Sunday, the 19th. On July 14th, Mola wrote to Lizarza formally accepting the conditions stated by Sanjurjo in his letter of July 9th, whose authenticity he had allegedly questioned. Martin Blinkhorn's statement that Mola had nothing to lose by doing so is not reasonable. Any leader, even if sure of victory, and no one was sure of victory in Spain at that point, has something to lose by putting political pledges in writing, specifically his freedom of action if he keeps his word, or if he does not keep his word, the difficulty he may later encounter in explaining why he did not keep it. It is more probable that Mola believed Sanjurjo wanted his agreement with the Carlists and, with the rising now imminent, decided to comply. This letter from Mola satisfied Falconde and Prince Javier. The Carlist rising in Pamplona was set for Sunday, July 19th, one day after the military rising, and the Prince and Falconde signed the order to mobilize the Requete. The traditionalist communion, with all its forces in the whole of Spain, joins the military movement for the salvation of the fatherland, assuming that His Excellency the General Director Mola accepts a program of government along the general lines contained in the letter directed to him by His Excellency General San Yurjo on the 9th of this month. The Raquette was ordered to recognize officers of the regular army as an overall command of the rising, but not to fight under any banner but the red and the gold, to keep their own symbols and organization, and where possible to make a consecration to the Sacred Heart, and to receive the sacraments in preparation for the crusade they were undertaking. An indispensable element in Mollah's plan for the rising in Morocco was to get Franco there, since he was confident, and rightly so as it turned out, that nearly everyone in the army in Morocco would follow Franco if he were present in person. Franco was stationed in the Canary Islands. There was not nearly time enough for a sea voyage, nor had Franco a plausible excuse for making one. He had to come by air, and air transport in 1936 was still largely the preserve of adventurers and inventors. It was still considered unusual and rather daring to fly across the English Channel, though there was a commercial airline making such flights. The overseas flight from the Canary Islands to Morocco was much longer, 150 miles, and no commercial planes flew it. The problem had been foreseen and a plan made to solve it. On July 5th, the publisher of Madrid's monarchist newspaper, ABC, called the paper's correspondent in London, Luis Bolin, with instructions to charter a plane in England able to fly from the Canary Islands to Morocco. Cost, Bolin was told, was no object. One of Spain's wealthiest men, Juan March, who had fled the country the day after the February 1936 election with much of his money, provided the funds. The Spaniard, Juan de la Cierva, inventor of the helicopter, was living in London. Bolin knew him well and called upon him immediately. La Cierva sent him to Croydon Airport near London the next day, where a small company called Ollie Air Services had a twin-engined de Havilland plane to rent called the Rapid Dragon, which could carry up to 7 people. La Cierva suggested he take along another man and 2 glamorous women to make the party look like tourists. On July 8th, they had lunch with Douglas Jerrold, editor of the Catholic periodical English Review. Bolin told Jerrold he needed a companion and 2 young and attractive women to accompany him on a mission to West Africa, whose purpose he could not disclose, but which, he was sure, the sympathetic Jerrold strongly suspected. Jerrold suggested a retired major, Hugh Pollard, who was expert with firearms and very much of your way of thinking. Pollard was called and agreed to see them at his home. A true British adventurer of the old school, he accepted Bolin's unique proposition after only a few minutes of reflection, and offered his daughter Diana and her friend Dorothy Watson, 19 and 21 respectively, as the glamorous blondes. Diana was overjoyed, bubbling, "It's too wonderful for words. I can hardly believe it." The next day, the 9th, Bolin paid Ollie Air Services for the rental of the Rapid Dragon, and was introduced to the pilot, Captain Cecil William Henry Bebb, young but very competent, with red hair and freckles, blue eyes, and an infectious grin. A mechanic and a radio operator were also engaged for the trip. At 7:15 in the morning, Saturday, July 7th, Bolin, Bebb, Pollard, Diana, and Dorothy, the mechanic and the radio operator, took off from Croydon, none but Bolin knowing their mission. Thus did the Rapid Dragon fly merrily into history, as its 2 beautiful feminine passengers flirted with its handsome young pilot under the indulgent eye of Major Pollard, while Luis Bolin's eyes kept slipping to his watch. As the tense drama of that cataclysmic week unfolds, the reader should always keep one ear open for the drone and rattle of the Rapid Dragon's twin engines, as its primitive propellers beat through the air, guided always by Cecil Bebb's steady hand upon the stick. After a sometimes harrowing 10-hour flight, during which the Rapid Dragon iced up over the Pyrenees and nearly ran out of gas over Portugal, since they had only road maps to set their course, Bebb landed at a military airfield at Espino, near Porto, at 8:15 in the evening. Diana and Dorothy helped to charm the lieutenant in charge into not arresting their party and confiscating their plane for their unauthorized landing. That night they dined in style at a restaurant called the Little Hidden One in Porto, and went on the next morning, Sunday the 12th, to Lisbon. General Sanjurjo was staying with his family at a small hotel in that city, but when Bolin went to see him, he found him not at home. Told he might be at the famous resort of Estoril, 16 miles away, Bolin got a car and sped out there, but still could not find the general. Returning to Lisbon, he amazingly encountered Sanjurjo in a car in a narrow street. Bolin told him he was going to bring Franco from the Canary Islands to Morocco. Sanjurjo assured him that his mission was supremely important, since only Franco could be counted on to rally the Moroccan army to the rising. Bolin now decided the time had come to let his English colleagues in on at least part of his tremendous secret. Their destination, he told Pollard, was the Canary Islands. If for any reason he was unable to go all the way there, the Major, after landing at the airport on Grand Canary Island, the only one big enough to accommodate the Red Dragon, was to go by sea to the island of Tenerife and contact Dr. Gabarda in its town of Santa Cruz with the message, "Galicia salutes France," which would mean the airplane had arrived. He and Deanna and Dorothy should then remain on the island for a few days and return to England by sea. To Bebb, he said only that his destination was the Canaries, and that he would have different passengers for the return journey, whom Pollard would have to present to him. Bebb responded, "Righto." Bolin and his passengers reboarded the Rapid Dragon and took off from Lisbon at 4:15 in the afternoon of a very hot day, determined to reach Africa before nightfall. In those days, no one who could possibly avoid it flew planes by night. Near sundown, at 7:45 in the evening, Captain Bebb landed at Casablanca in French Morocco. At 9:45 that night, a Phalangist hit squad shot and killed José Castillo, the communist lieutenant in the assault guards who had shot the Phalangists in the battle at the cemetery in Madrid on April 17th. At 2 o'clock in the morning of Monday the 13th, a reprisal team of assault guards, led by Fernando Condés, a close friend of Castillo, after obtaining authorization from the government's interior minister to arrest some Phalangists, went to the home of Antonio Goetia, a close parliamentary ally of the outspoken monarchist Calvo Sotelo, but found Goetia not at home. Then they went to the home of Gil Robles, but found him gone also. Then they decided to seize Calvo Sotelo himself. Calvo Sotelo's life had been threatened twice on the floor of the Cortes by militant socialists Nelken and Galazada on May 7th and July 1st. Early in July, his police escort had been told by a police official named Aguirre Sanchez not to oppose any attempt to assassinate him. José Calvo Sotelo did not fear death. Sometimes he seemed to invite it, to hope to become a martyr for Catholic Spain. At the great debate in the Cortes, June 16th, on the collapse of law and order in Spain, he had said, "I recall the answer given by St. Dominic of Silos to a Spanish king, 'Sire, my life you may take from me, but more you cannot take. Is it not indeed better to perish gloriously than to live in contempt?'" Informed July 8th of the orders given by Aguirre Sanchez not to protect him from assassination, he remarked that perhaps his murder would inspire the organizers of the projected rising to put aside their differences and unite. So when the fatal knock came upon his door in Velázquez Street in Madrid at 3 o'clock in the morning, and his night watchman let Condés and his team of vengeful assault guards into the house on the display of Condés's identification papers, Calvo Sotelo calmly told his wife and daughter that he would let them take him to police headquarters. From there, he said, he would telephone them later, "unless these gentlemen are going to blow out my brains." One of them, Victoriano Cuenca, a young Galician socialist, did precisely that as their service truck reached the corner of Ayala and Velázquez streets. Without stopping or even slowing down, they proceeded to the nearest cemetery. Captain Condés presented his papers again to the caretaker, who opened the cemetery gates. Calvo Sotelo's body was dumped inside without identification. The truck drove away. Almost as soon as they left the cemetery, the driver said, "Someone will surely denounce us. Condes replied, "Don't worry, nothing will happen." José del Rey, a friend of Condes, said in confirmation, "Whoever whispers a word about this is a dead man. We'll kill him in the same way that we killed that swine." Nevertheless, they were arrested the following afternoon, but there was not nearly time left to bring them to trial before the war began.